The next ones, we are simplifying the square root of a whole number less than 100. Now these are going to be ones that are not perfect squares. If you took your calculator and put in the square root of 45, you get one of those irrational numbers, 6.7082033932. Irrational numbers, non-terminating, non-repeating decimals. Well, they tell us to write it in simplified radical form. We can simplify it by factoring it into a perfect square times its other factors. So when I'm working with square roots, I want to know what my perfect squares are. 1 squared is 1. 1 times 1 is 1. 2 squared, 4. 3 squared, 9. 4 squared, 16. 5 squared, 25. 6 squared, 36. 7 squared, 49. 8 squared, 64. 9 squared, 81. 10 squared, 100. Obviously, I could keep my list going. My board moved on me again, but we can move that back. So, whenever I'm working with simplifying square roots, I want to keep in mind what my perfect squares are. I'm then going to look at the 45, and I'm going to divide that up into two factors. What times what is 45? One of my factors, I want to be the biggest perfect square that divides evenly into 45. So 100's too big, 81's too big, 64's too big, 49's too big, 36 doesn't divide into 45, 25 doesn't divide evenly into 45, 16 doesn't, but 9 does. I can make this 9 times 5. Now if I wanted to, I could write it as the square root of 9 times the square root of 5 and make 2 separate square roots. I'm just going to leave 1. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the square root of the one that's a perfect square. The square root of 9 is 3. So I write it as 3 times the square root of 5. Of course, I don't need the times sign in between. I can't even talk today. So if I were to check this, if I took my calculator and did the square root of 45, I get 6.708, so forth and so on. If I take my calculator and do 3 square root of 5, I should get the exact same number. 6.7082, so forth and so on. So you can kind of double check yourself by putting them both in your calculator and seeing if you get the same decimal number. Number 11. I want to rewrite the square root of 48 in simplified radical form. So on my square root, I want to factor 48. I want to be sure I use the biggest perfect square that works. Obviously, all of these numbers are too big. 36 doesn't divide into 48. 25 doesn't divide into 48. But wait a minute, let me check 16 out. 48 divided by 16. 3 times. So I'm going to say this is 16 times 3. I'm then going to do the square root of the 16. The square root of 16 is the nice whole number 4 that goes out in front. The 3 is going to stay under my square root, so I get 4 square root of 3. Now the problem with simplifying the square root of 48 is a lot of people will say, 48, 4 goes into 48 because they know 4 is a perfect square. If I take 48 and divide it by 4, it goes in there 12 times. And then they say, okay, the square root of 4 is 2 times the square root of 12. If you put in that answer, it's going to say you can simplify it further because 12 can be factored again. 12 is 4 times 3. The square root of 4 is 2. I have to multiply that by what's that in front because that's multiplying. 2 times 2 is 4. And notice I got the exact same answer, 4 square root of 3, but this took me a lot more work because I didn't pick out the biggest perfect square that goes into 48. So you want to be careful on things that are divisible by 4, that possibly they're also divisible by 16, and I can use a bigger perfect square. So always try to use the biggest one. I start with my list and just work my way backwards till I find the first perfect square that divides into my number, in this case 48. number 27 then. I want to factor 27. The biggest perfect square that happens to go into 27. 36 is too big. 25 doesn't work. 16 doesn't work. Oh, but 9. 9 times 3 happens to be 27. The square root of 9 is the nice whole number 3 that goes out in front. I have the square root of 3 left over underneath. And so 3 times the square root of 3 is my answer. Those might take you some work. Like I said, always keep that list of perfect squares handy. It makes your life a little easier to just check your numbers and work your way backwards.